This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. Today we're going to be talking about Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth Limited, and I'm going to give you my picks for 10 bad cards in the format that you should stop playing. As usual, when I do one of these videos about a format, I use 17 lands data to help me compile the list. I talk about 17 lands a lot in this series, but if you don't know what it is, you can go to 17lands.com. They track your data when you're playing limited, and they use all of that to come up with win rates for individual cards and things like that. And the cards that I'm going to be talking about in this video are all cards that are being taken fairly highly for how high their win rate is. It is always worth noting that data isn't everything. You shouldn't just use this data alone to determine like what cards you're going to pick and things like that, because context really matters what your deck needs and things like that. But nonetheless, these are cards that are being taken higher than they should be, and in most cases probably shouldn't even be played, and most of them don't look like they're actually that bad, but it turns out they are. As usual, I like to use sort of a baseline card to, give you a feeling for what the data means. And that card this time around, I wanted to use Westfold Rider. So I think we can all agree that this card is not anything special. It's fine. You'll play it if you need a 2-drop, 2 mana, 3/1, can occasionally destroy a problem permanent of, that's an enchantment or artifact. It has a 55.8% win rate. That sounds, if you're not used to 17 lands data, that sounds like it's actually really good. But the win rate of people who are on 17 lands is higher than it would be for if we included every Magic player ever. This makes sense. These are people who play a ton of Magic and who are signing up for a thing so that they can win more, and thus, they are winning more. And so the win rate on 17 lands overall right now in this format is 55.9%. So that tells you that Westfold Rider is like right around perfect middle of the pack. Card that is perfectly fine to play, but it's not really anything special. I'll tell you right now, every single card I'm going to talk about has a lower win rate than it does, and most of them are also being taken earlier than it is. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's get started with our list. I want to start with Soldier of the Grey Host. This is 3 generic and a white for a 2/2 with flash and flying. Gives +2/+0 to something when it enters the battlefield. It is taken around a 7th pick, and it has a win rate of 53.4%. So more than 2 percentage points lower than Westfold Rider. This card just hasn't been very good. It didn't look like it was going to be that good in the set review, but I think it's a card that people look at, and the reason it's being taken where it is it seems like it can do enough stuff to maybe be worth it, but you can envision it as sort of a combat trick because of the +2/+0, but the problem is a combat trick that only gives +2/+0 isn't a good card. It doesn't save your creature in combat or anything. You can kind of look at it as a card you can flash in and trade for something with 4 toughness or whatever, but it's not like you're really setting the world on fire with that either. And then the fail case for the card is pretty bad, where the ETB doesn't matter at all, and you have an incredibly inefficient flyer. So, generally, this shouldn't be making the cut in your white decks. There's lots of better cards around. Like, you'd probably want to play more Westfold Riders than you want to play Soldier of the Grey Host. So keep that in mind. Next, let's look at Peregrine Took. So this is a card that looked like it was going to be really powerful in this format. Food is a big theme in the set. This helps you make more of it, and then it lets you cash it in for cards. That seemed all like it was going to be pretty good. But there's a couple things going on in the format that have made it, and lots of cards like it, significantly worse. One of them is that color imbalance in this format is bad. It's not a terrible format, interestingly. I mean, I think it has its flaws that are going to keep it from ever being like a really good format. It's kind of impressive that green is as bad as it is in this format, and the format is still pretty fun. But, they did kind of completely miss on green being a color that you really ever want to be a primary color in the format. And they also kind of missed on the food deck. Sometimes you end up with a really synergistic green-white food deck, and it can sort of work out. But on average, it just doesn't work. I mean, people are still taking Peregrine Took pretty highly because if you just read this card, it does read very powerful. And you're like, well, there's lots of food in the format. This will work out. But it only has a 52.6% win rate, which is more than 3% lower than our friend Westfold Rider, who we saw at the beginning, and isn't anything special. Most formats end up having a worst color, of course. I mean, there's always going to be one. Usually they're not this much worse. It's been, I guess, probably since Forgotten Realms is probably the last time we saw a single color this much worse. It was blue back then. And they usually also whiff on one of the archetypes in most formats. It just ends up being a dud. And Peregrine Took sort of embodies both of those things. Cares about food and it's green, and that has really hurt its stock. And it's a card that you really shouldn't be taking early. You know, if the format were a little different, if they like pushed a few of the green uncommons that are actually pretty good down to common, like it would be a different, you know, situation. But given how the format is shaken out, you don't really want to be playing Peregrine Took. The synergy is hard to get there on, and, you know, green is bad, generally speaking. Let's look now at a mythic rare. And this is one I talked about last week when I was talking about cards I got wrong, but there were some people in the comments who were like, nah, it's amazing. And that card is Saruman of Many Colors. And again, this is a card where you read it and it seems super good, but and people are taking this one higher than anything we're going to see on this list. It's a mythic rare, makes sense, right? It's picked around the second pick, but does it have the worst win rate of any card we're going to talk about? No, but it does have the third worst win rate of any card I'm talking about at 49.8%. And the problem is most of the time this is just a hard to kill 6-mana 5/4. That's how it's shaken out. And that's just not good enough. The stats are bad. Your opponent can just attack into it really easily. Flyers and menace creatures and things like that are a nightmare because you spent so much mana on it. It just turned out, the two things that this makes you want to accomplish, which is first you have to cast a second spell in a turn, and then you have to mill cards, which it does. Milling the cards helps you because it increases your chance of having something to cast in your opponent's graveyard. But the problem is the types that it zeroes in on aren't really common enough against most opponents for you to consistently actually do something. So you have to do two things that are kind of hard to do, and making them both happen at the same time is tricky. So it's ended up being pretty much unplayable. So yeah, not good. This is a card, I don't know if I've ever gone in this direction where I gave a card a bomb grade and then it was an F. That's what this is. I've had some Fs that became bombs, but I think this might be my, the card I thought was a bomb that has slipped the farthest because it's just too difficult to make it work. It also doesn't help that the mana that it requires really is kind of challenging in this format. If you're not in green, it gets a little hard to fix. Speaking of fixing, I want to talk now about Shire Terrace. So this one is probably the least bad of any card on this list because sometimes you just have to run it. But it is a lot worse than you would think, and people are taking it higher than they should. It's taken around a 6th pick, and it has a win rate of 53.1%. So well below the median win percentage. Basically, this has been a lot worse than Evolving Wilds. I kind of thought going into the format, the fact that it can actually tap for mana right away was enough upside to make up for the fact that you had to pay 1. But it turns out not being able to fix your mana immediately in many situations is a big deal. And so this ends up being a little clunky, a little slow. Again, if you're splashing something incredibly powerful, by all means play Shire Terrace. But unlike Evolving Wilds, which makes sense in 2-color decks usually, you don't really want to play this in your 2-color decks. I think if people stopped playing it in their 2-color decks entirely, it probably ends up with a much better win rate, and that may be something we see as the format continues. But right now, people are taking it too highly and playing it in too many decks, so it has this very mediocre win rate. If you're in a 3-color deck and you're splashing something awesome, play it. But in all other situations, you probably should. Next, I want to talk about You Cannot Pass, which is taken around a 7th pick. This one really surprised me looking at the data. I couldn't believe it's taken this highly. And it has a win rate of 51.8%. This was a card I wasn't impressed with in the set review, and I'm still not impressed with it. Sure, it's easy to get sort of seduced by the fact that it costs 1 mana. When you make it happen, it's pretty good. So what's the problem? Well, even in this format where the ring tempts you and you're loaded up with legendary creatures even apart from that, actually lining this up to do the thing it's supposed to do is too hard. It's too narrow. So, the upside's there, but the downside is you never cast this. And that's too much of a downside, and that's why it has such a low win rate. Similarly, there's Ring Sight. This is another card that I didn't like in the set review, and it has sort of panned out that way, but people are taking it pretty highly. It does have a higher win rate than You Cannot Pass at 53.8%, but it's also taken around a 7th pick, like You Cannot Pass. So the problem here, and this is another card, especially if you don't play that much limited and you read this card and you're like, it's a tutor. Tutors are really good. And, that's true if you're playing a format like the Eternal formats or Commander. Like, tutors get a big upgrade. And limited, tutors are almost never good, especially when that's all they are. Sure, the ring tempts you with this. You get something, and that is powerful in the format, but it's not enough. So the problem is, sure, you get to search something up that has the same color as one of your legendary creatures or whatever. And, sometimes you can get something cool, but you pay 3 mana to draw a card. Like, think about it in terms of that kind of efficiency in limited. You would never play that card. 3 mana, draw a card, the ring tempts you. You're not playing that. You have Birthday Escape, which costs 1 mana and does the same thing. Sure, this gives you a little more modality, but in some ways, I guess you could argue that there's, it's you don't have as much control over what you get with Birthday Escape, but you can actually probably have the potential to draw more cards with Birthday Escape than you do with Ring Sight, which, it could be a land or whatever that you don't want, but you know what I mean. So, and the basic problem with most tutors in limited is that they cost, especially when they cost more, like once you talk about like 2 or 1 mana, things definitely get interesting depending on how the tutor works. And a tutor that's attached to a creature or something, that's a whole other thing. But a card that doesn't add to the board in tutors, I don't know the last time we saw one that cost this much that was actually good. And it's because the average power level of cards in limited just isn't high enough for you to search something up that's actually worth taking like what is usually a pretty big tempo hit, just spending 3 and not doing anything. So, don't play Ring Sight in most cases. It's another card sort of like Shire Terrace, where I think if people were only playing it in decks that really got there on legendary creatures and had some insane bomb to tutor up consistently, it would probably have a higher win rate, but people are playing it too much and they're taking it too highly given how narrow the card is. Let's talk about another rare that I talked about last week that I got some pushback in the comments about, and that is Horn of the Mark, which is being taken around a 3rd pick, has a win rate of 49.5%, has the 2nd lowest win rate of any card we're going to look at, and yet it's taken the 2nd highest. So the problem with this card, this is another one that I talked about it last week because I thought it would be okay. I thought, I think I gave it a B- in the set review. I thought that you'd be able to draw a card off of it often enough that it would be good. But, the more you play this format, the clearer it becomes that it's not that easy to make it happen. It's kind of a win more card. If you can already attack with 2 things into favorable blocks and stuff, you're probably already in a winning position, and it can help you sort of snowball and gain more of an advantage, when you're in that position. But the best limited cards are good in more situations than that. If you top deck this and you're at parity or you're behind, it is awful. And it also doesn't help that the format often involves you just attacking with like your ring bearer every turn. So it doesn't really work that well with the card. Next up, there is Gorbag of Minas Morgul. So this has the highest win rate of any card that we're talking about at 54.8%. So it's only 1% off the average. But people are taking it around a 4th pick, which is pretty crazy to me. It's another card where if you're just reading it and you haven't really played the format a lot, it's like, okay, it's a 2 mana 2/2 that has the words draw a card and make a treasure on it. Those are both things that have proven to be quite powerful in limited. But there's too much going on here. I'd say, I don't know, like 80% of the time when you see Gorbag, he's just a 2 mana 2/2. Does have a useful creature type, and that matters. But the problem really is that you don't end up in that many situations where you can send in something unblocked and it hits your opponent, and then you want to sacrifice it. It just doesn't happen. If your thing is successfully attacking your opponent, you probably don't want to give it up because it's something that can successfully attack your opponent. So you very rarely actually ever use these abilities. It's really awkward with armies too in many situations because, oftentimes if your army's getting through and hitting your opponent, it's because it's big, right? And you don't really want to give it up. You can sometimes combine it with the ring tempts you to send in like a small goblin and hit them and then draw a card or whatever, and that's fine. But most of the time, it just ends up being a 2 mana 2/2 with a useful creature type. Its ability is, it's not quite trinket text where it doesn't matter, but it's closer than it looks. Next, let's talk about Gwahir, the Windlord. So this is taken around 7th pick, and it has a 51.0% win rate. It's kind of sad. This is a signpost uncommon. These days, if you just assume every signpost uncommon is good, you're going to be right like 90% of the time. But this is one of those 10% cards where it just doesn't work out. Part of the problem is that the blue-white deck, in terms of being like this synergistic draw an extra card deck that Gwahir wants you to do, it doesn't really end up being that very often. It's just usually sort of like a tempo skies kind of deck. And in that deck, you're not super interested in playing a card that is a 6-mana 4/4 flying vigilance all the time. So, the fact that this can cost 4 sometimes doesn't really matter. It's easy to think about the ring tempts you triggering this, and sometimes that works because, if you have the second level on the ring tempts you, you can attack and you can loot, and suddenly Gwahir costs 4. That's great, but it doesn't happen often enough. And, if you could cast this on 4, it would be amazing if you did it consistently enough, but you just don't. Most of the time, if you drafted a blue-white deck, it's way better to just not play Gwahir and just play, like, some other medium flyer, like even the 5-mana 3/4 that scries 2, like, that ends up being better than Gwahir most of the time, even though it's not very exciting. So yeah, very disappointing signpost uncommon. It's being taken highly like signpost uncommons often should be, but this isn't one where that should be happening. So the last card I want to talk about is the one with the lowest win rate of them all. It's also picked the latest, so at least it lines up there. And that is Rising of the Day, which is picked around the 9th pick and has a 47% win rate. So this is the kind of card that tricks people all the time, and it's still tricking them, obviously, because this is utterly unplayable. You really shouldn't be playing this ever. And that means, while a 9th pick isn't exactly premium or even close to it, you shouldn't be taking it there. It should be the last card in the booster pack. That's how bad it is. And so, you read the card and it looks like it does some stuff, but the problem is that neither of the things it does are that good. Giving haste to things is something that's only relevant on like a small percentage of your creatures, because if your creature doesn't have a good attack, it doesn't matter, right? And then the fact that buffs legendaries, sure, there's lots of them in the format, but +1/+0 doesn't move the needle that much. It doesn't make your creatures into that much better attackers. And in fact, in a world of the ring tempts you, sometimes buffing the power of your legendary ring bearer isn't what you want to do at all, because it can suddenly be blocked by more things. Even if that weren't true, though, this is the kind of card that is always bad in limited. It does stuff, it has 2 lines of text that seem kind of exciting, that seem like they work well in the format. But overall, it just never ends up being worth the card or the mana that you spend on it, and that is like the exact opposite of what you want in limited. You need it to at least be worth the card, and ideally be worth the mana. This doesn't get there in either respect, so do not play it. So those are my picks for 10 cards in the set that are basically being taken too high for how good they are, and they're all pretty bad. Again, think back on our friend Westfold Rider, which is not a card that you're taking highly ever, but, playing 2 of them in every white deck feels perfectly fine. It doesn't really feel fine to play any of these in like a baseline deck of their color. There were a few examples, I think like Shire Terrace being the best one, where if people would play it in fewer decks, and in the decks where it's actually makes sense, it would have a higher win rate. So maybe it's not bad in the same sense as some of the others, but right now it's being taken too highly and played in too many decks. And, that's the problem. So that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to check out my draft videos of this format, my other analysis of the format, you can find those things on the screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.